I'd like to welcome Dr. Wendy Chung to the stage.
Thanks so much. So as we're doing this, we've had such success already that I'm trying to help us think collectively and think forward. And so many of you have different levers you can pull in doing this, but I'm trying to help you see the vision. And as I talked about last year, we're really trying to look forward as we think even about newborn screening, genomic newborn screening, and even prenatal diagnosis to make sure we can identify individuals at the right time to be able to give maximal benefit. So I have no disclosures. I know you've already heard about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I started on this journey thinking about one patient, and as we did this with KIF1A neurological disorder, you've heard from Dr. Bain about this. Even though I started the journey with one patient, we've realized that it's not just one person. We have a huge community internationally now for this, and within this, we also realize there's a huge amount of heterogeneity. And for this disorder, which is progressive at variable stages and with variable severity, we have a sense of urgency. I'll never forget the hashtag that the families came up with, hashtag stop the clock, in terms of thinking about that urgency and trying to prevent that neurodegeneration and going forward. Within this, and I know this is a little bit of detail, but I am going to go through some of the scientific details so you understand there are different classes for the ASOs. For some of them, the gene and the mutation is impacting in terms of a dominant negative, meaning that the gene is having essentially a poisonous effect. And I won't go through all of the biology in terms of how this happens, but we need to be able to do a very careful dance, which is getting rid of essentially the bad gene and keeping the one copy of the good gene. And even in doing that, we know that's not a perfect situation because people that have only one good copy of this gene still have issues. So it's what I think as a stopgap measure and a bridge to what ultimately we'll do, but an important bridge to have because, as I said, of the urgency for doing this. Just to give you a little bit of the nuance for this, this condition, and I'm only showing a subset of the mutations, is incredibly heterogeneous. And so one of the things that we've worked very hard on is understanding that heterogeneity. So each different variation that we have in this gene, and I say this because for some of your genes this applies as well, there can be a very different trajectory. Some individuals that will have a life expectancy of less than 5 years, other individuals who are going to have a life expectancy of 70 years. And there's a different set of urgency and a different set of risk-benefit that goes with this, depending on what that expectation is. And trying to understand that and get good information to set those expectations is critical. And so in the background, I know for many of your conditions, that's what researchers are doing to try and help you understand that risk-benefit profile as we go forward. In doing that, we've been, again, for this condition, it's complicated because kiddos are developing, so they're gaining skills over time, but then they're also, because of the degenerative nature, losing skills over time. And so one of the things that we've built into this is understanding by individual variation, what does that life course look like? What does that path look like to, again, give us better understanding of what to expect over time? What you can see from this, and I don't care that you look at the individual variants in looking at this, but you can see just from the plots, this is one individual and being able to look at them over time. And you can see that there's different trajectories. Some individual variants where things are relatively stable, other variants where things decline very rapidly. And I can say with actually great sadness that I recently had one of these babies in my hospital here in Boston where we had very little time to stop the clock and we lost him because we couldn't get him onboarded to something like an ASO quickly enough because of the time and the issues that come up with this. And so there are individuals where we literally have only a few months and other individuals where we have many, many years as we go forward. And so it's really figuring that out. So again, I'm not going to go over in terms of a lot of detail because you've heard about the first patient that Dr. Bain and I treated in doing this. As we did this, it was, to be honest, it was very brave of the family that did this because we didn't know what we were getting into. As we were doing this, we didn't know if it was going to work. We didn't know if there were going to be any side effects. And as we did this, we really did think about this from the point of view of one person and being able to come up with an effective treatment for that one person. In doing that, and again, I apologize about some of the technical aspects, but it's important. The ASO, we needed to, again, get rid of the bad copy of the gene only, and we didn't actually target the mutation itself or the pathogenic variants within that gene. We used what I often call a handle, something else we could grab onto and grab that copy of the gene and take it down and take it out, but it wasn't the actual mutation itself. So this builds into this second level of analysis, which we have to do, is we have to characterize for everyone in the community what their handle is, and that handle is not something that comes in with typical genetic testing. It's not something that's included, it's not even the target regions that the test looks at, so there's an additional level for the community writ large for CAND that we've had to do in terms of building in an understanding for that ASO, because it's not just what I was showing you in terms of the actual mutation. So after we do that, then the question becomes, as you develop ASOs to those handles, do you do it for one person at a time, or can you think holistically about the whole community? So can you do this in a more strategic way, where you're not just thinking one person at a time, once we know there's actually some traction that this strategy can work? And I think it's important to do that first person to be able to understand that the strategy will work and is safe, but then how do you think about leaving no one else behind as you go forward? So in doing so, the wonderful thing about this is that this particular ASO does have that specificity in terms of being able to do that quite effectively, taking out the bad copy of the gene. And that's, I have to say, a real, not just art and science, but a real specific expertise of the group at n-Lorem, and why they're so good at being able to do this. Again, I won't go into lots of detail. This is just showing from the first publication that we had over this to show that it in fact did work. It was quite remarkable in terms of improving behaviors, improving ability to walk, improving episodes of minimizing falls and seizure-like episodes. And the question now that we've done this and that she's been treated actually now for several years is, how do we think about the larger community, knowing that that larger community I would say every 3 or 4 days, I get a new email from someone else in the community who's been identified around the world someplace and trying to think about how they can onboard. And so this is a constant thing that's going on. And as I get all of this, I try and think about at a higher level how we're going to handle this. So the question becomes, as I said, for this one handle, we've now identified a couple of dozen individuals around the world with various different mutations that could benefit from this same handle. The second one is now being dosed, thankfully, and is being dosed safely in terms of going forward. And as we think about this, the question is, as in a global community, so we've heard about some of the issues with insurance and payments in the United States, now even think about the rest of the world and how complicated that gets, from the different regulatory agencies that are involved, the different providers, the skill set that's needed to do this safely and effectively, to be able to have the outcome measures to understand whether it's working. If you think about this in a global sense, because many of these, in fact, I would argue almost all of these rare conditions have no preference in terms of what part of the world they're in. They're actually equal prevalence around the world. How do we think globally about this, given that we've really got to stick together in terms of making progress? So in doing this, as I said, and just to give you sort of an accounting, for this one ASO that we have, we've gone through and figured out that about 20% or so, at least of the population that we've studied, which tends to be more US-based, could be treated by this one ASO. As we're starting to look at the rest of the world, we realize that percentage is a little bit less based on some other genetic factors globally, but take it for 20% for this one ASO. So that's great. We've got a big chunk to be able to go forward, but it's not everyone. So we started thinking about how can we really think about everyone? And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details except for a couple of you in the audience who will understand this, but we've cataloged really all of the common genetic variants that go across the gene so that we can think about all the possible handles that could be used. And if you do that and do the calculation, if it were possible, in fact, to develop ASOs that could be safe and effective for these polymorphisms, you would take a different strategy in terms of being able to do that. And you could, with a library of probably less than 10 ASOs, really be able to have the world's population in terms of treatability across those different alleles. And so the question becomes, as a strategy, do you think now if there's a condition that has traction, do you think globally in terms of developing that library and those assets to be able to work for everyone? So as we're doing this, and I won't belabor the concept to do it, but it is a different strategy. And part of the question now for many of you that are thinking about your own child, your own family, that makes a lot of sense. Now if we think about the next step in terms of the other members of our community, how do we do that? For some of you, just so there's not confusion, there is an there's a non-specific ASO. So for instance, Dr. Bain was talking about H&R and PH2. That's relatively easy. You can do one size fits all in terms of everyone being able to do that, and so you don't have to worry about that strategy for those conditions. You guys are set, you're good to go, and that's amazing. But there are, for others, where we're talking about things that are allele specific, there's this greater complexity, and I'll say in terms of looking at the dynamics of family groups and communities in the rare disease space, it's really critical to be able to have that group work as a collective whole and to keep those groups together, working together. And so I think it's really important to think collectively for those groups and leave no one behind. As we do this, and as we've talked about these issues, there are important regulatory issues. So whether it's in Australia, whether it's the EMA in Europe, others, there is a global effort, many of you know, in terms of thinking about the N of 1 community globally. So I think it's important to be able to slot into that to make sure that we're part of that. And as I now travel around the world in terms of seeing some of these facilities and opportunities to be able to do this, I do think it's something that you could have centers of excellence, hospitals that have all the right people to be able to do this safely, effectively, and have the expertise in terms of the outcome measures to do this, that may not have all of the deep expertise in terms of those conditions, but they've got the facilities, they've got the wherewithal in terms of being able to do it and slot in individual patients with the rare conditions as we go forward. And so thinking about that network and what we can do to be able to do that, I think is important. As we think about that, there are different financial models around the world and actually different costs even to be able to do that. That's potentially a benefit if there are parts of the world that can do this at scale, potentially less expensively. I think that's an asset we need to think about. And as we do this, there is some variability in the clinical trial for each individual person, even with the individual condition, depending on their age, where they are along the life course and along that disease trajectory. But there are many things that are common. And I think it's critical to be able to standardize and do as many things in common across those conditions, because at some point there is going to be a question of whether or not we can pool the data across some of these to see some of the power to be able to develop some of the policy decisions we need to do later. So as I said, within this, one of the other keys that you already heard about are some of the safety issues. And so to the extent that we can build in similar safety issues or safety measures that are going across conditions, now that we have some experience under our belt doing that from the very beginning, with some of these even being increasingly sophisticated as we can see some of the things we have to look at. And as we're doing this, as I said, being able to make sure that we can scale this. So with that, I'll be glad to take any questions, but in a very, I'd want to put a very sort of, make sure that you understand the context. I'm saying this because I think we've got tremendous opportunities in the future, and it's critical that we don't lose any time as we go from the N of 1 to the N of the possibilities in the next step as we go forward. So incredible opportunities, and I hope we can realize all the benefits that we have in store. Thanks.